This is Team 3's analysis of the attention economy, using Meta as the case study. In 1971, Herbert Simon observed that in an information-rich environment, attention becomes a scarce resource information competes for. This framing underlies the analysis as follows. This presentation opens with the theoretical foundations driving this market, presented by myself, Ahsan Riaz, and Ibrahim Rizwan. We will then apply these mechanisms to the committee's policy problem, presented by Mian Shaayan Akbar, Muhammad Ahvar, and Syed Saad Qutab. The first short answer question asks who a platform such as the Meta actually sells to. A common but inaccurate answer is that Meta sells to its users. In reality, Meta is a two-sided market, acting as an intermediary between users seeking connection and advertisers seeking access to user attention. As Roche and Tirol showed, profitability depends on not only total revenue, but on how prices are allocated between the two sides. That allocation reflects cross-site network effects. Each additional user greatly increases advertisers' willingness to pay through more impressions and richer data, while each additional advertiser contributes little and perhaps negatively to user utility, since advertisements consume feeder spaces. Two further factors determine the optimal allocation: own price elasticity and homing behavior. Users have relatively elastic demand because substitute platforms are available, whereas drive advertisers, especially small businesses, have relatively inelastic demand because Meta is often their most effective channel. This same asymmetry also determines the tax incidence we discuss later. The result is straightforward. The elastic side is subsidized and the inelastic side is charged. And users therefore face a price of zero. Importantly, zero is not the unconstrained profit maximizing price. In theory, the optimal price would be negative, but paying users would encourage fraudulent accounts, making zero the lowest sustainable price. The next section will be presented by Ahsan Riaz.
The second short answer question asks why an advertiser pays more for a targeted advertisement occupying the same screen slot as an untargeted one. The infrastructure is identical in both cases. What differs is information. Behavioral data lets the platform predict which impression is more likely to convert, raising the marginal product of advertising expenditure. The brief reports clicks to rates two to three times higher for targeted ads because the inventory is fixed in the short run. This gain in advertiser valuation shows up as price rather than quantity and is captured by the platform as economic rent payment above what is required to supply the good arising because supply cannot expand in response. Next slide. This advantage compounds for two reasons. Data is non-rival. Using one advertiser's targeting data does not use it up for the next, and predictive accuracy improves at an increasing rate with data volume. So more data produces a qualitatively better model rather than a proportionally better one. Unlike a public good, this data is excludable. Since the platform controls access to it, so it behaves as a proprietary asset that new entrants cannot acquire through capital alone, as the binding constraint is accumulated history rather than funding. Next slide. This explains the concentration referenced earlier in this presentation. The top five platforms hold approximately 65% of a $700 billion market. Computing the Herfindahl Hirschman Index, the concentration measure used by the US Department of Justice in the merger review. On the top five firms alone produces a value above 1,300 within the range regulators treat as warranting security. In a market with near zero marginal cost, competitive pricing would ordinarily be expected. The observed concentration is instead consistent with this mechanism. The next section is presented by Ibrahim Rizwan.
The third short answer question asks whether users as a group benefit from or are harmed by supplying data and time at a price of zero. Standard theory says voluntary consumption of zero priced goods implies positive consumer surplus, but the inference requires two assumptions and neither hold there. First, the price is not actually zero. Users pay in attention up from roughly 90 minutes in 2013 to nearly 2.5 hours in 2023. And in behavioral data, worth approximately $68 per user in North America, for which they receive no compensation. Next slide. Second, choice does not reliably reveal preference. A 2022 survey found 72% of the users had tried to reduce their usage, and of those, 54% were unable to do so, consistent with present bias rather than stable preference to continued use, formalized by O'Donoghue and Rabin in 1999 as time inconsistent preference, where the present self overweighs immediate reward against what the future self will regret. This distinction matters for the policy choices ahead. An externality, a cost imposed on the third party, is corrected through pricing. An internality, a cost that present self imposes on the future self, cannot be, since the individual is undervaluing not someone else's cost but their own. So correction requires changing the structure of their own choice. The gap between the observed use of 147 minutes and the efficient 95 minutes is 52 minutes daily, is attributed primarily to internality. Next slide. This is not a claim that users gain nothing. Genuine surplus exists in low-cost communication and social networks with documented labor market value. A further problem compounds this. Users cannot observe the algorithm's objective function, which platforms describe only as maximizing engagement. So they lack the correct beliefs a choice needs to reveal true preference. The conclusion is that early consumption is welfare enhancing, while consumption at the margin, driven by engagement optimization, is rather user intent, is welfare reducing. Hence, establishing these structural mechanisms, Mian, Shaayan, Akbar will now present the committee's problem.
The problem solving question asks for a specific recommendation covering all four options the committee is considering, with a full economic justification. That problem is presented here as three structurally distinct failures, not one: a behavioral internality, a negative externality affecting adolescent mental health, and structural market concentration. Under Tinbergen's rule, named for Jan Tinbergen, the first recipient of Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, correcting a given number of independent policy targets generally requires at least that many independent instruments, so a recommendation built on a single instrument will leave at least two of these three failures uncorrected. Next slide. Three constraints were applied to every candidate policy. Net welfare gain, evaluated across a plausible parameter range rather than a single estimate. No market exit, tested using the long run condition comparing total revenue to total cost rather than short run shutdown condition. Since a policy can since a policy can pass the short run test and still cause exit over a longer horizon, and proportionality, meaning the instrument acts on the specific failure mechanism rather than the market's general operation. Four candidate solutions were evaluated against three constraints, and three are rejected over here. Moving on to the next slide, option A, data minimization, represents a data privacy perspective. It prohibits behavioral or profiling outright. This correctly targets the data asset. Recall the earlier chart showing the targeted advertisement price of 20.4, but the instrument is disproportionate. It removes targeting for users who actively consented to it, and it does not address the internality, since an untargeted feed can still be unstructured to maximize engagement. Option C now, an attention lever, represents a fiscal Pigouvian perspective, a tax on time spent on the platform. Tax incidence theory holds that the burden of tax falls on the less elastic side of a market, and advertisers, particularly small businesses with few alternative channels, sit on that less elastic side here. So the tax would likely be borne substantially by small advertisers rather than the platform. It also taxes every hour of use identically, so it is not calibrated to the internality it targets. Option D now, structural separation, represents a competition policy perspective, requiring the advertising business and the social networking business to operate as separate legal entities. Ranking and ads are being run on the same infrastructure and the same data. So separation duplicates that infrastructure rather than creating two independent smaller firms. And it does not transfer the accumulated behavioral data that constitutes the entry barrier facing any new entrant. The next section is presented by Muhammad Ever.
Option B, an algorithmic choice mandate, represents a behavioral choice architecture perspective, and it is the only option that satisfies all three constraints. It sets the non personalized feed as the default state while keeping the personalized algorithmic feed fully available through explicit opt in. This rests on the default effect, a well documented finding in behavioral economics. Thaler and Sunstein described this approach as libertarian paternalism, where no option is removed but the outcome for non choosers changes. Madrian and She found that switching 401 enrollment from opt-in to opt-out substantially increased participation. Johnson and Goldstein found the same pattern in organ donation registries. Next slide. The policy frontier chart plots expected net welfare gain against distortion and exit risk for each option. Options A and D sit inside the zone where exit risk is material, and option A additionally falls below zero welfare gain. Option C sits at moderate risk, but option B sits at low risk with a substantial welfare gain of its own. But alone, it leaves the externality and the concentration failure unaddressed. Next slide. Because option B alone is incomplete, the recommendation combines three instruments consistent with Tim Mergen's rule. The chronological default addresses the internality. A narrow levy applied only to users who opt into the algorithmic feed and calibrated to measured engagement above the chronological baseline, addresses the residual externality, and carries a 5-year sunset with independently audited metrics. Mandated data access for independent researchers and portability of targeting segments for small advertisers address concentration without requiring separation of shared infrastructure. Moving from option B to this hybrid marked on the frontier chart buys a substantial increase in welfare gain for a small increase in risk. On to the next slide. This is not simply a restatement of existing law. As just noted, the DSA requires platforms to offer a non-personalized feed as an alternative, or recommendation requires it to be the default. That distinction is not marginal, since default effects are among the most robustly replicated findings in behavioral economics, so an option that must be sought is close to the one that does not exist. To the last slide, the welfare recovery chart plots marginal cost and marginal benefit against daily platform use before and after the default change. Re-anchoring the default alone moves observed use from 147 minutes to 128 minutes a day, closing roughly 37% of the 52-minute gap between observed and efficient use without removing any option available to users. The final section will be presented by Syed Saad.
This section examines the recommendation's robustness, its impact on different stakeholders, and the main objections regarding it. The biggest concern is that users might simply opt back into the algorithmic field, making the default an ineffective choice. However, the sensitivity analysis shows that the net welfare remains positive even if opt-in reaches 100%, because choosing to opt-in are by definition users, those who benefit from algorithmic recommendations. As a safeguard, if opt-in exceeds 80%, the 2 years in the levy becomes the primary policy instrument. Next slide, please. Using the Caldoc Higgs efficiency criterion, which states that a policy is effective insofar as those who benefit from it is larger than those who bear the cost, we feel that this recommendation poses an overall welfare of 23 units, primarily because users and the public sector benefit most through the improved well-being and reduced mental health costs. Platform advertisers face losses with the greatest proportional impact on small and medium advertisers, which is why an advisor portability is included as a third policy instrument. Next slide, please. Three objections were further raised. First, that a chronological field may increase low quality content. So safety and spam filtering are still retained while engagement is based upon rankings is removed. Second, platforms could manipulate the choice screen, so regulations require both visual prominence for both options and ban repeated prompts. Finally, to prevent the policy from remaining indefinitely, it includes a 5-year sunset clause with a scheduled review. And overall, this recommendation not only includes behavioral and fiscal measures, but also structural to discuss market failures and hopefully remove their effect on the market as a whole. That concludes this presentation.